The opening race of the 2020 Formula 1 season was supposed to take place last Sunday, but after the outbreak of COVID-19, aka coronavirus, and with one member of the McLaren F1 team testing positive, it was announced that the 2020 Australian Grand Prix was cancelled, with the races in Bahrain, Vietnam and China also postponed to a later date. The same has happened to races in Holland and Spain, with the Monaco Grand Prix cancelled altogether and the new regulations for 2021 delayed for a year. As such, many F1 fans will be wondering what to do with this time, especially as many people will be forced to work from home or not leave their homes at all. One thing I've been doing is going back and watching old F1 races, starting with the 2006 season, which was the season I watched my first ever F1 race, the 2006 Brazilian Grand Prix, which was Michael Schumacher's last before his first retirement. The season overall was a battle between Schumacher and Ferrari and the 2005 world champion Fernando Alonso and Renault, who was looking to win his second world championship before his move to McLaren in 2007. The season saw the introduction of 3 new teams, Toro Rosso, Midland F1 and Super Aguri, saw drivers such as 2016 world champion Nico Rosberg, Scott Speed and Yuji Ide, who could forget, make their debuts in the sport, and saw the introduction of a knockout qualifying system brought in for the first time to great success. The season was also the last with 2 different tyre manufacturers being in the sport, in Bridgestone and Michelin. With Michelin leaving the sport at the end of the season, there were quite a few memorable moments and races throughout the season, which I may talk about in another video. But one of the most famous races, especially if you're from the UK, came at Hungary on the 5th of August 2006, when the famous words in the title were said by commentator James Allen.
He's proved the critics wrong. They said he might never win a Grand Prix. He's done it!
This is the story of the 2006 Hungarian Grand Prix. Going into the race weekend, Fernando Alonso had an 11-point lead over Michael Schumacher in the World Championship standings, but he was not on his best form and neither were Renault. Schumacher had won the previous 3 races, with Ferrari finishing 1-2 in 2 out of the 3 races. Alonso, meanwhile, finished 5th twice, losing 14 of his 25-point lead in just 3 races. Renault's lead in the Constructors' Championship had gone down from 34 points to 10 as well, as Ferrari were the team to beat. Renault had been running with what was known as a tune mass damper for the first half of the 2006 season. It was fitted in the nose of the car and comprised of a mass mounted in a spring, which helped to dampen out tyre bouncing frequencies throughout corners, helping to keep the car flatter and make grip more consistent. However, it had been banned by the FIA before the previous race at Germany, as they believed it was a movable aerodynamic device, but Renault believed it wasn't, and it was intended to help with the loading of the contact patch of the tyres. The FIA also feared that the devices would become heavier and be a greater safety hazard. Nevertheless, the race stewards at the German Grand Prix agreed with Renault and they deemed the damper legal, but the FIA appealed their own stewards after the decision, and the hearing for the appeal was to be held after the Hungarian Grand Prix on the 22nd of August. Therefore, Renault decided not to run with the damper for both races in case it was deemed illegal and they lost their points for those races. Renault claimed it would cost them about 0.3 of a second per lap without running it, and although most teams were running it, it would affect Renault more as they had built their car around it and had been using it for almost a year. The other big story going into the race weekend, apart from potential driver lineups for 2007, was the debut of Polish driver Robert Kubica for BMW Sauber, replacing 1997 world champion Jacques Villeneuve, who had been involved in a crash at the German Grand Prix, and despite coming out the race unhurt, had complained of having headaches going into the weekend. In doing so, Kubica would become the first Polish driver to race in Formula 1 after being BMW's test driver for the season leading up to the Hungarian Grand Prix. Finally, ITV co-commentator Martin Brundle was not at the race weekend as he was on holiday, so Honda test driver Anthony Davidson would take his role alongside James Allen for the race. Before qualifying had even begun, there were 3 key moments that would affect the grid. Firstly, Fernando Alonso reacted angrily to Red Bull test driver Robert Dornbos on a start-finish straight in Friday's second practice session. As he gestured with his hand, he almost drove into Dornbos and tried to brake test him into the first corner, which resulted in him receiving a 1-second time penalty for each session in qualifying, and he would go on to receive a further 1-second time penalty for overtaking under yellow flags later in the session, giving him a 2-second penalty. This meant whatever his fastest time was at the end of each session, he would have 2 seconds added to that time. Then, Jenson Button's Honda engine blew up in practice going through turn 4, resulting in a red flag and Button needing to replace his engine, which would mean a 10-place grid penalty. During that red flag, Michael Schumacher overtook 3 cars just before the pit lane, including Alonso, who was possibly going too slow and braked as Schumacher went to overtake. This gave Schumacher the same penalty as Alonso, a 2-second time penalty for each qualifying session. While both drivers made it through the first knockout session, they were both knocked out in Q2 due to their time penalties, with Schumacher starting 11th and Alonso 15th. Jenson Button managed to qualify 4th, just behind his Honda teammate Rubens Barrichello, but his engine penalty meant he would start in 14th. Red Bull's Christian Klein was meant to start in 13th place next to Button, but he had a fuel leak and ended up starting in the pit lane in the spare car before the race. In ascending order, the top 10 was Nick Heidfeld, Robert Kubica, Jarno Trulli, Giancarlo Fisichella, Ralf Schumacher, Mark Webber, Pedro de la Rosa, Rubens Barrichello, Felipe Massa, and McLaren's Kimi Raikkonen on pole, his second pole position in a row, although without Schumacher and Alonso's penalties, that may not have been the case. Sunday arrived, and it arrived with a sight that F1 fans like to see, but team owners, especially those fighting for the championship, hate to see: rain. It was the first wet race of the season, with the Michelin running teams running wet tyres that had never been used in a race before. The conditions were changeable as well, with teams unsure whether they should start on full wets, also known as the extreme tyres, or intermediate tyres, with the consensus being to start on intermediate tyres unless more rain was to fall. As mentioned in the pre-race commentary, changeable conditions could help cars starting outside the top 10, as they could fill their cars with as much fuel as they want, whereas the top 10 would have to run the fuel they had in qualifying, meaning they may have to stop an extra time than they ideally would want to. Button would still have to start on the fuel he had in the final part of qualifying as well, despite dropping 10 places due to his engine change. Most cars ended up starting on the intermediate tyres, but Barrichello and Michael Schumacher went for the full wet tyres. Pedro de la Rosa managed to spin his car at turn 12 on the formation lap, near where there was a large part of standing water on the track, but he was able to get back in position for the start of the race. As the race started, both McLarens of Raikkonen and De La Rosa got off the grid well, with De La Rosa overtaking the poor starting Massa for second place, although Barrichello would overtake him as well. However, Michael Schumacher had the best start, moving up from 11th up to 6th place in the first corner, and by the end of the first lap, he had moved up to 4th, behind De La Rosa, Barrichello and Raikkonen. Alonso had managed an even better start, and was up from 15th to 7th, and he was hounding Schumacher's teammate Massa for 6th place, who he passed at the start of the second lap. And he then passed his teammate Fisichella later in the lap to move up to 5th, whilst the BMW of Kubica spanned from 8th place. Further down the field, Webber dropped from 5th to 17th and then retired on the second lap. Button moved up from 14th to 8th, and Yamamoto retired on the first lap for Super Aguri with a technical problem. By the start of the 4th lap, Alonso was all over the back of Schumacher, who was 4 seconds a lap slower than leader Raikkonen, and it was clear that Alonso was faster than Schumacher too. Amazingly, at turn 5, a corner not known for overtaking at all, Alonso managed to drive completely round the outside of Schumacher to take 4th place in what was the first on-track overtake between the two drivers all season.
He is 4 seconds off Raikkonen's pace, so clearly he's in a very vulnerable time. Alonso's going round the outside of him. This is the first time these two have taken each other on all season on the racetrack. Every other pass has taken place in the pits. Wonderful track action there between the two of them.
On lap 5, De La Rosa overtook Barrichello at turn 2 to go up to 2nd and make it a McLaren 1-2 as it stood. Barrichello then decided to swap from full wets to intermediates at the end of the lap despite more rain starting, causing him to go behind Heidfeld in 10th. Meanwhile, off camera, Button had moved up to 5th place, overtaking both Fisichella and Massa, and at the start of lap 7 he overtook Schumacher at turn 1 to move him up to 4th in the race after starting 14th. Massa then span, which allowed David Coulthard past him, and at the end of lap 7 the top 8 was Raikkonen, De La Rosa, Alonso, Button, Michael Schumacher, Fisichella, Coulthard and Massa. Massa would soon be overtaken by Heidfeld for 8th place a couple of laps later as he ran wide at turn 13, and on lap 12 Massa came into pit and put on the full wets after struggling on the intermediate tyres. A couple of laps later, Schumacher and Fisichella had a close battle for 5th place, with both drivers touching on at least one occasion going through the final few corners. At the end of lap 16, De La Rosa came in and was going to put on full wets, but a last minute call saw him switch to full intermediates instead, and the small delay due to this saw him come out behind Fisichella and Schumacher, who were still fighting for position. This time round, Fisichella managed to get past Schumacher, who clipped and damaged the left hand side of his front wing on the right rear tyre of Fisichella after a snap of oversteer. This resulted in De La Rosa passing Schumacher later in the lap, who pitted at the end of the lap along with race leader Kimi Raikkonen and Jenson Button, with intermediate tyres going on to all 3 drivers. Then, in a frantic few moments, Fisichella went off at turn 8 and hit the tyre barrier on his side, but he managed to keep the car going and carry on, whilst De La Rosa ran wide at turn 11. However, Fisichella would soon be out of the race due to the incident, as his rear wing was loose and almost falling off. Seconds later, Kubica lost his front wing at turn 5. On lap 21, it was Rosberg's turn to be out of the race after a crash at turn 13, and strangely, he was still in the car when the removal truck picked his car up to move it from the circuit. Over the next few laps, the rain would stop and the track would start to dry out. Michael Schumacher was the only driver of the top 8 using Bridgestone tyres, despite Bridgestone expected to have the wet weather advantage. But it was far from that, with Schumacher and Massa both running almost 7 seconds a lap slower than Alonso, and when both Alonso and Schumacher met on the track on lap 25, it wasn't for position. It was for Alonso to lap his closest championship rival.
Just imagine what's going through the mind of Michael Schumacher right now. After 3 consecutive race victories, he is lapped by the man he's fighting for the world title.
The next big moment in the race came on lap 27. De La Rosa had caught up to the back of Raikkonen and was looking to overtake him to move up to 2nd place in the race. However, he wouldn't need to use any of his racecraft to overtake Raikkonen on track. Heading out of turn 5, the Toro Rosso of Antonio Liuzzi had slowed down to let both McLarens lap him, but Raikkonen didn't realise until it was too late, and he ran straight into the back of Liuzzi, destroying the front left of his car and almost flipping over Liuzzi, with Liuzzi's rear wing just about hanging on to his car. Raikkonen had to park his car on the grass, and with the debris on the track, the first safety car of the race was called, which was a surprise it hadn't been sooner. De La Rosa pitted immediately, and many other cars pitted, including race leader Alonso. As the safety car came in at the end of lap 31, the order was Alonso, Button, De La Rosa, Barrichello, Heidfeld, Coulthard, Michael Schumacher and Ralf Schumacher. However, Michael Schumacher span at turn 2 on the restart, but he remained in 7th, with Massa overtaking Ralf Schumacher to move up to 8th. Button was stuck behind a couple of lap cars, which helped Alonso build a gap, but Button slowly brought that gap down to around 5 seconds on lap 37. Meanwhile, Massa, Kubica and Ralf Schumacher were all battling for the final point, which was then holding up Barrichello. Kubica did manage to overtake Massa for 8th place though, and then drove away. By lap 40, it was looking possibly dry enough to put on the dry tyres, but there was a chance it could rain again. Meanwhile, Michael Schumacher had finally found speed, and he overtook David Coulthard for 6th place. Scott Speed was the first driver to risk it on the dry tyres, but he struggled immediately coming out of the pits and span on his first lap out, and he soon came in for intermediate tyres. Meanwhile, Button was continuing to close the gap to Alonso, and by the start of lap 43, it was down to under 2 seconds. On lap 44, Schumacher overtook Heidfeld for 5th place, while his teammate Massa had pitted, putting on another set of intermediate tyres. Whilst on lap 45, Kubica pitted, but left his intermediate tyres on and just pitted for fuel. On lap 46, 2nd place Button came in, who had been less than 1 second behind leader Alonso for a couple of laps, and like Kubica, he came in just for fuel and didn't change his intermediate tyres, with Michael Schumacher following suit. Despite not changing tyres and adding fuel, Button was catching Alonso at a rate of 2 seconds per lap, setting the fastest lap of the race. Both Toyotas of Trulli and Ralf Schumacher then pitted for dry tyres, and with 20 laps to go, Barrichello did the same, Ralph's running in 4th. 1 lap later, Alonso and De La Rosa pitted and fitted dry tyres as well, which promoted Button to the lead of the race. However, moments later, this happened.
There is Alonso. He's off! Fernando Alonso is off! The World Championship leader has stopped, and Jenson Button not only leads, but he leads by 22 seconds. And that's a rear suspension failure or something. The wheel nut flies off, is it? The wheel nut's blown off. The right rear corner, I believe.
Fernando Alonso crashed at turn 2 on lap 52 after the right rear wheel nut appeared to fall off, causing him to spin and hit the tyre barrier backwards. However, it was later revealed by Alonso that it was a drive shaft failure, not an issue with the wheel not being fit properly. It was his first retirement of the season, and not only could it be costly to Alonso's championship hopes, it gave Jenson Button over a 20-second advantage out the front of the race. Could this be it? Could this be Jenson Button's first ever win in Formula 1? In his previous 112 races, he had finished 2nd 4 times and 3rd 9 times, along with 3 pole positions, but he had never managed to convert it into a win. But this was surely the best chance he ever had of winning a Grand Prix. It was also 63 races since a British driver had won a Grand Prix, the last being David Coulthard's win in Australia in 2003. The car was able to be removed without a safety car, with Heidfeld now up to 2nd behind Button, but needing to pit again. Michael Schumacher in 3rd, followed by De La Rosa, Barrichello, Coulthard and Kubica. At the end of lap 55, Button came in and filled up till the end of the race and put on dry tyres, and unlike Alonso, all of his wheels went on properly and he had no issues around the first corner. Not long after, Heidfeld pit from 2nd for dry tyres, promoting Michael Schumacher to 2nd and De La Rosa to 3rd, with Heidfeld in 4th. With 12 laps to go, Button led Schumacher by 16 seconds, which would usually be a good margin to have, but not when you haven't won a Grand Prix before. The conditions were changeable, and the driver chasing you was 7 times world champion Michael Schumacher. However, It turned out the main battle was between Schumacher and De La Rosa, with De La Rosa catching Schumacher at a rate of 1 to 2 seconds per lap, sometimes 3 seconds per lap, as Schumacher was still on his intermediate tyres and had yet to change to dry tyres. While Schumacher was running in the 1 minute 29s, his teammate Massa on dry tyres was running in the 1 minute 25s, but he would lose more time by changing his tyres with just a few laps to go than staying out on intermediates. With 6 laps to go, De La Rosa attempted a move on Schumacher at the chicane at turns 6 and 7. Both cars went toe to toe, but Schumacher had to cut the chicane to avoid any contact, but he stayed in front as a result and perhaps gained an advantage by doing so. 1 lap later, however, De La Rosa tried an overtake at the same corner, and despite Schumacher cutting the chicane for a second time, he let De La Rosa pass for second place. It was then Nick Heidfeld's turn to attempt to overtake Schumacher, who by this stage was clearly slower than the cars around him. At the same corner as De La Rosa, Heidfeld attempted to overtake Schumacher. However, there was contact and Schumacher damaged the front of his car and, along with his heavily worn tyres, struggled to get round the rest of the lap, nearly missing the pit lane entry as he came in. He wanted to have some new tyres fitted and continue for the last 3 laps, but he was retired from the race, meaning both of the championship contenders would fail to score points in a race for the first time in the 2006 season. At the same time as this was going on, Jarno Trulli retired with an engine problem, but he was running out of the points. The main focus now was on Jenson Button, however, who, despite having an incredible race, didn't actually feature as much as you would expect, partly down to the championship battle between Schumacher and Alonso. Thankfully for him and Honda, he would have no late dramas, and he would come home to win both his and Honda's first Grand Prix, with both James Allen and Anthony Davidson very happy, to say the least.
And for Damon Hill before him, because here in his 113th Grand Prix start, he's proved the critics wrong. They said he might never win a Grand Prix. He's done it! Jenson Button wins the Hungarian Grand Prix. Get in there!
Yes, 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 I can't believe I was the one commentating for this race. Martin Brundle, what have you done? This is fantastic, fantastic for the team. I'm so happy. You can see everyone cheering there. All my guys, this is just emotional stuff.
De La Rosa would go on to finish second, his first podium in Formula 1, with Nick Heidfeld finishing third to give BMW their first podium in F1 too, so it's a podium of firsts. The rest of the top 8 was Barrichello, Coulthard, Schumacher, Kubica and Massa. Unsurprisingly, Jenson was delighted with his first win. There is a famous photo of him with his eyes wide open not long after he got out of the car, celebrating what he had just done. He would go on to be a specialist in changeable conditions, winning similar races at Australia in 2010 and famously in Canada in 2011. Honda had been looking to challenge more up to that point in 2006, and despite a pole position and a podium for Button earlier in the season, they'd started to fade away, and with Jenson coming up to the prime of his career, it was beginning to look like he may end up a wasted talent. So this win came at a perfect time for him. However, both he and Honda couldn't kick on as they both would have liked to. Both 2007 and 2008 were very poor years for them both, and with Honda pulling out in late 2008, there was a chance Jenson was out of Formula 1. But we all know what happened from then, and if you don't, then I'll have to make a video on it soon. Having watched this race for the first time before making this video, it definitely lived up to expectations. I knew about Alonso's amazing move on Schumacher, and both championship rivals struggling in the race, but I didn't realise Alonso was leading and then had the issue he did out of the pits, and that Schumacher retired as well. I would definitely recommend watching it back if you can, as I still don't think I've done it justice. Going back to the race before I go, Kubica was eventually disqualified after finishing 7th, as his car was found to be 2 kilograms underweight. This promoted Massa to 7th and Michael Schumacher to 8th, meaning Ferrari closed the gap on Renault to 7 points and Schumacher closed the gap on Alonso to 10 points. It was a weekend to forget for both the championship contenders, and despite glimpses of quality from both and a bit of bad luck on Alonso's part, they had both underperformed and would hope this was just a small blip with just 5 races to go, but who would go on to win the World Championship in 2006? I guess I'll have to make another video for you to find out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos like this. If there is any particular race or season you want me to cover next, let me know in the comments below. I may end up doing the 2006 season as a whole soon, or possibly the 2006 Italian or Brazilian Grand Prix, which I will soon be watching myself. Also, please let me know your memories of the race, and finally, if there's any way I can improve my videos, please let me know. I'm always looking to improve. See you next time.